How natives Alaskans fought against the Russians. Russia had its own Indian Wars. The largest occurred in Alaska in the early 1800s. The Russian Tlingit War is mostly unknown in America, yet it directly affected Russia's decision to cede Alaska. Russian trappers and hunters developed a maritime fur trade. This instigated conflicts with the Aleuts in the 1760s, but it was so lucrative that the Russians expanded it. Eventually, they reached Alaska. In 1784, explorer Grigory Shelihov founded a permanent settlement. Three Saints Bay was Russia's first Alaskan settlement. Within 10 years, Orthodox Christian missionaries began to arrive. They evangelized thousands of Native Americans. By the late 1780s, trade relations had opened with the Tlingits, but the Tlingit people were different from the Aleuts. They were fierce and proud warriors. 3-year-old Tlingit boys were taught to swim in the open sea. They did it regardless of the season. Then they would be whipped in public to make them resistant to pain. The boys were taught to use weapons from an early age. The Tlingit wore leather vests made of seal or moose hides. They had armor made of hard wood to intimidate their enemies. They wore monstrous masks. The Russians were terrified of the Tlingit. Tensions on Sitka Island were growing with every month. The Russian-America Company built an outpost there. It was protected by the Imperial Russian Navy. Many local Aleuts were Russian allies, but not the Tlingit. The local Tlingit clan had many grievances. The colonists had occupied the most strategically advantageous point. They erected a stockade around it. The so-called Old Sitka was more like a fort than a trading post. The Russians demanded the locals swear allegiance to the Tsar. They conscripted native men to work the outpost. Finally, in June 1802, a war party of Tlingits raided Old Sitka. The Russian settlement was practically razed. The attackers burned cabins, warehouses, and dry docks. They massacred 150 Russians, along with Aleutian workers. They captured some of the families of the dead settlers. Russian Governor Alexander Baranov paid a ransom for the hostages. 2 years later, he organized an expedition to reclaim the island. In September 1804, the Russian warship Neva arrived at Sitka. It was followed by a flotilla of Aleut dugouts. The Battle of Sitka lasted 4 days. The Russian landing force comprised 150 men. They were joined by 400 allied Aleuts. They attempted to storm the Tlingit village, but the Tlingits had reinforced their defensive palisade. They laid down heavy musket fire. They even managed to get off a few shots from a cannon. 12 Russians were killed. Baranov responded with a naval artillery bombardment. The Tlingit lost an unknown number of men. In the end, they were forced to call for truce. The Russians re-established their base. Sitka became the capital of Russian Alaska in 1808, but the Tlingit managed to expel the Russians from Yakutat. They destroyed their settlement and shipyard. The Russians never returned to Yakutat. In the 1850s, the Tlingits attacked Sitka. Yet again, a raiding party very nearly captured the town in a 2-hour battle. They were eventually repelled by Russian artillery crews, but Russia had had enough. In 1866, it ceded Alaska to the United States. The Tlingit have never been confined to a reservation.